I should have burned the letter. Not torn it into pieces. Not hidden it in a drawer. Burned it. Because fire would have been easier than living with what those words demanded from me. The strange thing is, writing "You're the woman I'm going to marry" wasn't the brave part. Anyone can say beautiful words when emotion is loud enough. The real cost came afterward. Once those words existed, they stopped belonging to me. They belonged to someone who could either protect them or break them. And that kind of surrender terrified me more than failure ever had. People assume men are afraid of commitment. They're wrong. Some men are simply afraid that, once they're fully known, they'll stop being admired. That's a different kind of fear. It's quieter. Much harder to admit. I remember the room that night with uncomfortable clarity. The city outside had finally gone still. A faint streetlight slipped through the curtains, drawing pale lines across the wooden floor. The only sound was the slow ticking of an old clock that suddenly felt louder than my own breathing. The paper rested in front of me, blank, almost accusing. I leaned back in the chair and laughed once. Not because anything was funny, but because my own hesitation felt ridiculous. I had negotiated difficult conversations without raising my voice. I'd walked away from opportunities that everyone else chased. I'd made decisions that affected entire teams without losing a minute of sleep. Yet one blank page had reduced me to silence. Isn't that strange? How a single honest sentence can be heavier than years of achievement. I picked up the pen, put it down, picked it up again. Every time the ink touched the page, another thought interrupted me. What if she sees the parts of me I've spent years hiding? Not the polished version, not the composed man everyone expected. The one who still questioned whether he deserved to be loved without earning it. That thought had followed me longer than I wanted to admit. Here's something most people never say out loud. Success can become a disguise. The more people admire you, the easier it becomes to perform for them. Until one day, you can't remember where the performance ends and you begin. That's an uncomfortable truth. And I had become very good at performing strength. There was another memory that kept returning that night. Years earlier, someone I cared about looked at me during an argument and quietly said, "You always know what to say, but I never know what you actually feel." I defended myself then. I explained, I justified, I even convinced myself she was wrong. But memories are strange. They don't disappear because you've won the argument. They wait. Sometimes for years. Then they return exactly when you're trying to become someone different. So there I was, staring at a blank page while hearing words I thought I'd buried. Maybe she had seen something I refused to see. Maybe I had mistaken emotional control for emotional honesty. Those aren't the same thing. Not even close. Let me ask you something. When was the last time someone truly knew you? Not the version that keeps everything together. Not the version that always has the answers, but the part of you that quietly wonders whether you're enough when nobody is watching. Think about that for a second. Not what people assume about you. What they actually know. There's usually a painful difference. I finally lowered the pen again and looked out the window. The streets were almost empty. A lone car passed beneath the streetlight before disappearing into the darkness, and for some reason I envied it. It kept moving without needing certainty. I couldn't. Because this wasn't really about a letter anymore. It was about identity. If I wrote those words, I could never pretend they didn't matter. If I promised a future, I'd have to stop hiding behind the image of the man who always seemed untouchable. Maybe that's why so many people stay emotionally unavailable. Not because they don't want love. Because love removes every safe place to hide. Here's the pattern nobody expects. The strongest walls are rarely built to keep other people out. They're built to keep ourselves from being seen. Mine had taken years to construct. Discipline, control, achievement, confidence. Each one looked like a strength from the outside. Together, they formed a fortress. The problem with fortresses is they protect loneliness just as effectively as they protect pride. I looked back at the page. This time, my hand didn't shake. Not because I had become fearless, because I had finally become tired. Tired of being respected but not understood. Tired of conversations that never reached the truth. Tired of carrying an image that grew heavier every year. Slowly, I began writing. Each word felt less like ink and more like removing another layer of armor I'd worn for so long that it had started to feel like skin. When I reached the final sentence, I stopped. "You're the woman I'm going to marry." I read it once. Then again. The room was silent. Nothing had changed. The walls were still there. The clock was still ticking. The city was still asleep. And yet, everything inside me felt different. Because the hardest part was no longer writing the letter. It was deciding whether I could actually send it. What happened after that decision is something I wasn't prepared for, and neither was she. Sending the letter should have brought me peace. Instead, it exposed a silence I had been outrunning for years. You'd think that after making a decision like that, something inside me would finally settle, that certainty would replace the tension, that courage would feel rewarding. It didn't. The morning after I sent it, I woke before sunrise. The room was still dark, the air unusually cold. My phone rested on the nightstand, face down, as if even it understood that one notification had the power to change everything. I didn't touch it. Not because I lacked courage, because I suddenly realized I had spent my entire life controlling outcomes, and for the first time, I couldn't. That feeling was unfamiliar. It was almost humiliating. For years, I had built a life that rewarded discipline. Every decision had a purpose. Every risk had a calculation. Every setback became another lesson I could master. People admired that version of me. The composed man, the reliable man, the man who never seemed shaken. But admiration has a dangerous side that no one talks about. Sometimes people stop asking how you're doing, because you've convinced them you'll always be fine. The strange part? You begin believing it too. I walked through my day exactly as everyone expected. Conversations happened, meetings ended, smiles appeared on command. My voice never cracked, my posture never changed. If someone had looked at me from across the room, they would have thought I was completely at peace. They would have been completely wrong. Because there are battles that make no sound, and those are usually the hardest ones to survive. Have you ever noticed how exhausting it is to protect an image that everyone else loves, while quietly wondering if anyone would still stay if they met the person underneath? That question followed me everywhere. Not loudly, just enough to keep every room feeling a little emptier than it should have. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Loneliness doesn't begin when you're alone. It begins the moment you realize nobody knows what you're refusing to say. That realization changed how I looked at every conversation. People complimented my confidence. They called me focused, resilient, unbreakable. Every compliment felt heavier than the one before, because none of them were describing me anymore. They were describing the character I had learned to play. Here's something unexpected. The strongest man in the room is often the one most terrified of disappointing everyone who believes he's strong. That fear doesn't shout. It negotiates. Don't tell them you're struggling. Handle it yourself. You've come this far. Don't let them see you now. And if you listen long enough, that voice begins to sound like wisdom. It isn't. It's isolation wearing confidence as a disguise. One evening, long after the city had fallen quiet, I found myself standing in front of the living room window. The lights from distant buildings flickered against the glass, like tiny reminders that thousands of lives were unfolding at the same time as mine. Somewhere, people were laughing over dinner. Somewhere, someone was apologizing. Somewhere, someone was falling in love. And there I was, standing in complete silence inside a beautifully organized apartment that suddenly felt too perfect to be lived in. Everything was exactly where it belonged. Except me. I realized then that I had spent years building a life that looked impressive from the outside. The problem was, I had forgotten to ask whether it actually felt like home. That thought unsettled me more than I expected, because it forced another question I had avoided for years. What if I've spent more energy becoming admirable than becoming known? There's a difference. One earns applause. The other requires surrender. Most people chase the first because it's safer. Very few survive long enough without the second. You know what I regret? Not the long hours. Not the sacrifices. Not even the relationships that slowly drifted away while I convinced myself I was too busy. I regret every moment I confused emotional distance with emotional maturity. Those are not the same thing. One protects your ego, the other strengthens your heart. I learned that much later than I should have. As the days passed, I found myself replaying ordinary moments that had never seemed important before. The conversations I ended too quickly. The hugs I shortened because vulnerability made me uncomfortable. The messages I never answered because I told myself there would always be another opportunity. Life rarely announces what will matter later. That's why we overlook it. And that's why regret arrives carrying memories we once called insignificant. Tell me honestly, if someone you love disappeared from your life tomorrow, would your last conversation sound like the truth? Or just another routine exchange? Most people never ask themselves that question until it's far too late. I almost became one of them. The letter had done something I never expected. It hadn't simply exposed my feelings for another person. It had exposed the distance between the man everyone recognized and the man I had quietly become. Closing that distance would demand far more than one page of honest words. It would require changing habits I had mistaken for identity. And then, my phone finally lit up. I looked at the screen. I saw her name. But it wasn't the message I had spent days preparing myself to read. It was something else entirely, and from that moment on, nothing unfolded the way I thought it would. Her message was only 5 words long. Can we meet tomorrow evening? No explanation. No heart emoji. No reassurance. Just 5 words that somehow carried more weight than every page I had written. I stared at the screen until it dimmed. Then I unlocked it again, reading the same sentence as if hidden meaning might suddenly appear between the letters. It never did. Sometimes silence isn't the absence of an answer. Sometimes silence is the answer. You're just not ready to understand it. The next evening arrived slower than any day I can remember. The sky was fading into deep blue when I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet cafe tucked away from the noise of the city. It wasn't crowded. Just a few warm lights glowing through the windows, soft music leaking through the door each time someone walked in. I sat inside before she arrived. For the first time in years, I had nothing to prepare. No strategy. No perfect words. No version of myself to perform. Just truth. And strangely, truth felt far more dangerous than failure. I kept watching the entrance. Every time the door opened, my heartbeat betrayed me. I used to believe courage looked like walking into difficult situations without fear. I don't believe that anymore. Real courage is remaining honest after fear has already arrived. There's a difference. A very expensive difference. While I waited, my mind wandered somewhere I hadn't visited in years. I remembered being younger, convinced that becoming successful would solve every insecurity I carried. I thought confidence could be built like a business. Earn enough respect, achieve enough goals, collect enough victories. Eventually the doubt would disappear. It never did. It simply learned how to dress better. That's the pattern nobody warns you about. Your insecurities don't always leave. Sometimes they evolve. They become polished, articulate, impressive, until even you mistake them for ambition. Have you ever spent years becoming someone everyone admired, only to realize you no longer recognized yourself when the room became quiet? That's a frightening question. Because if your answer is yes, you already know what comes next. The cafe suddenly felt smaller. The conversations around me blurred into distant noise. A spoon clinked against a coffee cup somewhere behind me. Someone laughed near the counter. Life continued as if nothing extraordinary was happening. Meanwhile, my entire identity was sitting across from an empty chair. I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, I didn't see confidence. I saw exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying an image that's heavier than your own heart. And then another memory surfaced. Years ago, someone had once asked me a question I dismissed without thinking. What do you need? Such a simple question. I answered by talking about work, responsibilities, future plans, everything except the truth, because I genuinely didn't know. Isn't that unsettling? To become so skilled at meeting everyone else's expectations that you lose the ability to recognize your own emotional needs. That's not maturity. That's disconnection. Here's an uncomfortable truth. Many people don't abandon themselves in dramatic moments. They do it quietly. One ignored feeling at a time. One difficult conversation postponed. One vulnerable sentence swallowed before it's spoken. Eventually, the distance becomes so normal that loneliness feels like personality instead of pain. I wondered if I had done exactly that. Not just for months, for years. The waitress approached and asked if I wanted anything while I waited. I almost ordered coffee. Instead, I asked for water. It seemed insignificant. But it wasn't. For once, I wasn't reaching for something to distract myself. I wanted to feel every uncomfortable second exactly as it was. No escape, no performance, just presence. That frightened me more than I expected. Here's something unexpected. Healing rarely begins with being understood. It begins when you stop running from your own thoughts. That evening, there was nowhere left to run. I could hear every fear clearly. What if she says no? What if she says yes, but to someone I pretended to be? That second question stayed with me, long after the first one faded. Because rejection hurts. But acceptance, based on a mask, that terrifies you in a completely different way. If someone falls in love with your performance, who will love you when the performance ends? Maybe that's why so many people become trapped inside relationships they secretly feel alone in. Not because love failed. Because honesty arrived too late. The door opened again. Cold evening air drifted through the cafe. I looked up. She had arrived. She stood there for a brief second, scanning the room before her eyes met mine. She smiled. Not the smile I had imagined, not distant, not overly warm. It was impossible to read. She walked toward the table with calm, steady steps, holding something small in her hands. At first I thought it was her phone. Then I noticed it wasn't. It was an envelope. The same color as the paper I had used for my letter. She placed it gently on the table between us, but didn't push it toward me. She didn't speak immediately. Neither did I. The silence wasn't awkward. It felt intentional, as though both of us understood that whatever happened next couldn't be undone. Then she looked directly into my eyes and said the last thing I expected to hear. I've been waiting for someone to write those words. She paused. But not for the reason you think. And in that unfinished sentence I realized the story I had been telling myself was only half the truth. She didn't open the envelope. She simply rested her hand on top of it, as if what was inside deserved silence before words. The cafe around us faded into the background. Cups clinked softly. A chair scraped against the floor somewhere behind me. Outside, rain had begun to fall, tracing slow lines across the window until the city looked blurred, almost unreal. I waited for her to continue. Instead, she studied my face. Not the way people look at someone they're trying to impress, the way they look when they're deciding whether you're finally telling the truth. Then she spoke. You know what surprised me about your letter? I expected her to mention the promise. The future. The sentence that had kept me awake for nights. She didn't. It wasn't that you said you wanted to marry me, she said quietly. It was that, for the first time, I couldn't tell where your confidence ended and your heart began. Her words landed harder than any rejection could have. Because she had noticed something I had barely admitted to myself. The man I had become wasn't false. He was incomplete. For years, I believed strength meant carrying every burden without asking for help. I believed calm meant never letting anyone see uncertainty. I believed leadership meant always knowing the next step. Those beliefs helped me build a life. They almost destroyed my ability to share it. Here's the pattern nobody expects. Sometimes your greatest strength becomes the exact thing standing between you and the life you actually want. That realization unsettled me, because it forced me to question every version of myself I had admired. Was I disciplined, or simply afraid of depending on anyone? Was I independent, or terrified that needing someone would make me weaker? Those questions don't arrive politely. They tear through the stories you've spent years telling yourself. Have you ever defended a part of your personality for so long, only to discover it was built around an old wound you never healed? That's one of the hardest moments a person can face. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. She slowly slid the envelope toward me. I wrote something too. I looked down at it, but didn't touch it. Somehow, opening her words felt even more frightening than sending mine. Not because I expected cruelty. Because truth has a way of rearranging your entire life. There are moments when a single sentence quietly divides your life into before and after. I had a feeling this was one of them. She leaned back in her chair. I need you to understand something. Her voice never rose. It didn't have to. I've never been afraid of your ambition, she paused. I've only been afraid that one day your ambition would become the only version of you that survived. I couldn't answer. Not because I disagreed. Because there was nothing left to defend. An uncomfortable truth surfaced inside me. You can become so committed to being respected that you accidentally become difficult to love. Not because you're unkind, not because you're selfish, but because you've trained yourself to offer reliability instead of intimacy, achievement instead of presence, solutions instead of honesty. Looking back, I realized how often I had confused providing with connecting. I thought showing up meant solving problems. Sometimes showing up simply means staying, even when there is nothing to fix. That lesson arrived years later than it should have. Tell me honestly, when someone you love shares their pain, do you immediately search for an answer? Or do you make them feel safe enough to keep talking? Those are two completely different gifts. Most people never learn the second one. I hadn't. The rain outside became heavier, tapping gently against the glass. Neither of us spoke for a while. Oddly enough, the silence no longer felt threatening. It felt earned. For the first time, I wasn't trying to impress her with certainty. I wasn't choosing perfect words. I wasn't calculating the safest response. I was simply there. Completely, and that frightened me in a new way. Because vulnerability doesn't guarantee you'll be loved. It only guarantees you'll finally be seen. There's a difference. A painful one. Then another thought entered my mind, unexpected and almost impossible to ignore. What if love isn't about finding someone who accepts your strongest qualities? What if it's about finding someone who refuses to walk away after meeting the parts you've hidden from yourself? That possibility was far more intimidating than romance. Because it demanded something I had spent years avoiding. Consistency, not the consistency of success. The consistency of emotional honesty. No masks on difficult days. No disappearing into work when conversations became uncomfortable. No pretending everything was fine, because it seemed easier than explaining why it wasn't. I had spent years mastering discipline. Now I was being asked to master openness. The second challenge felt infinitely harder. She looked at me again, her eyes softer now. There was one sentence in your letter, she said, that made me cry. I searched my memory, trying to remember every word I had written. Before I could ask which one, she gently opened the envelope she had been holding all along. Inside wasn't a reply. It was something I never imagined she had kept. And the moment I recognized it, I realized the story between us had begun long before I ever wrote that letter. She unfolded the paper with extraordinary care. Not because it was fragile, because memories are. I leaned forward, trying to understand what I was looking at. The edges were worn, the folds softened by time. It wasn't the letter I had written, it was much older than that. She smiled not with excitement, but with the quiet sadness of someone revisiting a part of herself she had hidden for years. I've carried this with me longer than I should have, she whispered. Then she turned the paper toward me. It wasn't a love letter, it was a list. A handwritten list of promises she had once made to herself after walking away from a relationship that had broken her trust. At the top, in faded ink, one sentence stood alone. Never confuse beautiful words with a beautiful character. I couldn't speak. Because in that instant, I realized something I had never considered. My letter had never been competing with another man. It had been competing with her pain. That changes everything. We spend so much of our lives believing people respond to who we are. Sometimes they're responding to what they've survived. That's an uncomfortable truth most of us never understand until it's too late. She looked out the rain-covered window before continuing. When I read your letter, she said, I wasn't asking whether I believed your words. She paused. I was asking whether I believed my own fear. There was a difference. A profound one. For years I thought trust was something another person earned. Sitting across from her, I understood that trust is often a conversation between someone's present and the wounds their past refuses to release. You can't win that conversation with charm. You can't solve it with promises. You certainly can't rush it. That realization humbled me more than any failure ever had. For so long, I had measured relationships by effort. If I cared enough, worked hard enough, remained loyal enough, then surely love would make sense. But love isn't a transaction. It doesn't reward the person who tries the hardest. It reveals the person willing to remain honest when certainty disappears. That thought settled over me like the rain outside. Calm, heavy, impossible to ignore. Let me ask you something. Have you ever expected someone to trust you, without realizing they were still carrying memories they never chose? If you have, then you know how easy it is to mistake caution for rejection. Sometimes people aren't pulling away from you. They're protecting the version of themselves that once trusted too quickly. That deserves compassion, not resentment. For the first time in a very long while, I stopped trying to be understood. Instead, I wanted to understand. That single shift changed the atmosphere between us. The silence no longer demanded answers, it created space. And maybe that's what love has been all along. Not perfect conversations, not dramatic declarations, but two people becoming safe enough to tell the truth without fearing what the truth might cost. Here's the pattern nobody expects. The moment you stop trying to win someone's heart, you finally become capable of protecting it. I had spent years believing love was proven through certainty. I'll always be here. I'll never let you down. I know exactly what our future will look like. Those promises sound comforting. But life rarely honors certainty. Character does. Presence does. Patience does. Looking back, I realized my letter was never powerful because it predicted forever. It mattered because, for the first time in my life, it was completely honest. Not polished. Not strategic. Just honest. And honesty has a strange quality. It asks for nothing in return. The rain outside had almost stopped. Soft evening light slipped through the clouds, painting the calf in warm gold instead of gray. It felt as though the world had quietly exhaled. She reached across the table. Not dramatically. Not like the ending of a story. Just enough for her hand to rest beside mine. Close enough to erase distance. Far enough to remind me that closeness is still a choice. Neither of us moved. Neither of us needed to. Some moments become unforgettable precisely because nothing extraordinary happens. The extraordinary part is who you've become by the time they arrive. I looked at her, and for the first time, I wasn't wondering whether she would choose me. I was wondering whether I could keep choosing honesty every day after this one. Because one vulnerable letter changes a moment. A vulnerable life changes everything. Before we stood to leave, she folded the old paper one last time and placed it back into her bag. Then she looked at me with a calmness I had never seen before. There was one more reason I asked you to meet. She smiled gently. I haven't told you the most important part yet. She stood, picked up her coat, and walked toward the door. I remained seated for just a second longer, watching the rainwater glisten beneath the streetlights. It struck me that every chapter of this story had begun with words. A letter. A message. A confession. But somehow I knew the next chapter wouldn't begin with anything either of us said. It would begin with a choice neither of us was ready to make. And that choice would reveal whether love is built by promises or by the quiet decisions no one else ever sees.